What's up guys, today I'm happy to share with you my favorite chess opening for Blitz, which is the one where you face your opponent playing either e4 or d4 or basically any other move, and you then play pawn to b6 followed by bishop b7. That is usually called the Owen's defense, and it's a lot trickier than it seems at first, because it may not seem like an ambitious opening, but bear with me for a couple minutes and you'll see how tricky it can get very fast for white. Now, if your opponent starts off with the move pawn to d4 first, and we'll talk about e4 a little later, basically you'll do the exact same thing, then they usually follow up with c4, as that's how they usually proceed in the queen's gambit. You play your stuff bishop b7, which controls the square e4. Now white gets their knight out, knight to c3, preparing for this pawn to advance to e4 and grab the center. You go pawn e6, that's your basic setup here. And in most cases your opponent will be tempted to go e4, seemingly grabbing the center, and at first it looks super advantageous for white. Like white gain this space, white gain this central control. But your plan is to let white build their center for a moment, but after that you start counter-attacking it viciously. It's kind of the same plan that black uses in the Grunfeld Defense, which is one of the mainstream opening, but here in this Owen's defense, the exact same plan somehow is not considered correct, and many think that this is an unsound opening that white should somehow refute or stuff like that, but it's not the case. Now we go bishop b4 here, which continues your plan. Now this bishop pins the knight down to the king, and therefore the knight can no longer move, which makes it possible for you to grab the central pawn on the next move. And that's the very first little trick. In fact, quite often your opponent will overlook this thing, and they'll do something to counter the pin, like play bishop d2 or something like that, and then you can trade off the knight and simply win this pawn on e4. Very often your opponents will blunder the central pawn just like that. Anyway, let's go back and let's consider some of the best move for white. Of course, it makes a lot more sense for white to go bishop d3, which develops bishop and provides support for this pawn. So far so good, white still feels that they're in control, but now you start challenging them. And you go here pawn to f5, which already creates a bit of an uncomfortable situation for white, because so far white thought that they were having a completely comfortable position, but now they have to calculate variations and they are somewhat under pressure. Now, what do now? You're threatening to capture this pawn and to win it. Therefore, they gotta do something about that. Very often, your opponents will simply grab this pawn on f5, because the way of their calculation will be, hey, I take here, if he recaptures, I take it with my bishop and I want a pawn. That's how they calculate it. And again, they're still under this false impression that you're playing an unsound opening that they should refute, right? And f5 also seems like a risky choice for black. But in fact, it's the first opening trap. Here you just grab this pawn on g2, and all of a sudden, white loses the rook for nothing on the next move. So basically, here it's move 6 of the game, and white can safely resign right here. I mean, they can try this check to your king, but that doesn't really change anything. Your king slides to f8, and the main problem here persists. White cannot do anything with the rook. If they trade on e6, once again, that doesn't change anything. You're going to go knight f6 and chase this queen away. You're going to win the rook. Your queen is active along the d-file, so everything's great, and white's position is completely lost. An interesting fact about this opening is that I recorded my first videos about this more than 10 years ago. And up to this date, when I meet some chess players who happen to know me from the internet, very often they tell me, hey Igor, by the way, I play your opening. And I ask which one. They say that b3 opening. So people clearly enjoy that because it works really well in Blitz. You can see how tricky it is. Now, let's see if white can play anything better here. After you just played f5 challenging white's center, it's quite logical for white to play f3 and to defend their center that way. In that case, I recommend that you attack the most vulnerable pawn of white's pawn chain. Here, if you look at these pawns, the c4 pawn is defended, the e4 pawn is defended, the one which is left undefended is the one on d4, and therefore you can go knight c6 and counter that pawn. Now, you never worry about this pawn to move forward, because if they try that, in fact, it's pretty good. Now you're going knight to e5, and your knight goes forward, it advances to this active square, pushes the bishop, attacks the pawn, so that's pretty nice. And generally speaking, your plan is to undermine white's center, to attack it. Therefore, here you're doing just that, you're fine with that. It's better for white probably to play knight to e2. And in this case, white indeed maintains their center intact, but here there is another annoying thing that you can do for white. It's the move queen to h4. All of a sudden you take aim at this king, and they gotta play g3. And after queen h5, what you achieved is, you see that white has weaknesses basically all around. If you look at their position, their center is somewhat shaky, it's constantly under your pressure. This bishop is pinning the knight. They've got a lot of weak holes here on the king side, you know, so that if they ever castle there, they'll be in trouble. And overall, their position is overstretched, and you're making use of that to attack all these weaknesses. For example, if white castles, and you go knight to f6. So far it looks like white's position is okay, but in reality it is very dangerous, because again, like they can't move this knight, for example, because if they ever move it somewhere, they're gonna lose this pawn on d4. Also knight g4 is coming potentially, followed by queen takes h2 checkmate. I mean, it's simple, but still quite annoying. For example, if white goes something like this, bishop e3, that'll fall to knight to g4. You know, and knight threatens this bishop, queen threatens, queen takes h2, so that is completely losing for white. And you can see that it's just not that easy for white to move. In the game we're analyzing, which was by the way played between two 2400 rated players in an over-the-board game, white played pawn e5, thinking that they're doing something active here, but black refuted that with knight takes e5 and finished the game in style. It turns out that after pawn takes, this king is extremely vulnerable. You can see that our bishop is doing a great job attacking this long diagonal, and now after we reroute this bishop to this diagonal, it turns out that the king is nearly checkmated. Rook f2 is the only meaningful move to cover the king, but then you can attack and win the game in multiple different ways. The fastest is a pretty move, queen to f3. Again, rook is pinned, right? And now you're threatening some sort of queen g2 or queen h1 checkmate on top of queen takes f2 checkmate. So that was a really beautiful finish for this game. And you can see how shaky and fragile white's position is. Just one little inaccuracy can cost them a game instantaneously. On a side note, as I mentioned earlier, you can definitely play the exact same variations with white. Having an extra tempo, that'll be even stronger. So you play b3, bishop b2, pawn to e3, all the same stuff with white. And then you've got a single opening that you can use both as white and as black in every game that you play. If you're curious about b3 for white, I've got another video about that, which you may check out later, and then you'll have this comprehensive knowledge about this opening. Alright, we've just covered the first move, pawn to d4. What if your opponent goes e4, which is even more common? Your moves are going to be the exact same. Pawn b6, pawn d4, bishop b7, hitting this pawn on e4. In most cases, they're going to defend it with their knight to c3, which is already a somewhat inaccuracy, although it's really difficult for white to comprehend that, of course. You still play pawn e6, enabling your bishop to go out there. So after they play knight to f3, you play bishop b4. Now, as we said previously, very often they'll overlook the fact that the knight is pinned, and therefore you can grab this pawn on e4. They'll play some bishop d2 move or stuff like that, and they'll overlook this pawn on e4. So that's the first little trap. So let's say they're going bishop to d3 here. What do you do next? Well, you keep attacking. You play knight f6, renewing your threat to this pawn. It is still hanging. Remember, this knight is pinned, right? Cannot move. So therefore, you're threatening to capture this pawn on the next move. Sometimes your opponents will even try something like this, which is once again complete nonsense, because after this exchange, you just win this pawn anyway, right? The knight is pinned. Now you're attacking it, so that doesn't help. What else can they do? I mean, Stockfish says that knight to d2 is the best move for white, but of course it's so unnatural to lock this bishop and to move the knight back that no human will ever play this. Very often they'll play e5, hoping that that kicks your knight back. But we're not going to go back, we're going to go forward. Therefore, go knight to e4. And that's the most aggressive move for black. Now you're challenging this knight on c3, it's pinned and attacked. And what's good about this knight on e4 is that, you know, it also controls this d2 square. So if white wants to move their bishop there, you'll be able to trade it off. By the way, we're now worried about a potential exchange of the light square bishop, because if white is willing to trade off their powerful bishop, we're perfectly fine with that, right? We traded off their very active bishop, and on the future, if let's say they castle, you can drop your bishop back, because now, you know, it's hanging, or you can trade over here, and then you go d6, knight to d7, you still challenge white center. Your bishop is excellent along this diagonal, white has a bunch of weak pawns, and you have a very nice game here. So we're not worried about that, let's take it back. Therefore, if they ever willing to trade off their powerful bishop, that's nice for us. But in most cases they won't. They'll think how to defend this knight, and they'll instead play bishop to d2. And now we're also fine with that. We're going to grab the other bishop. Generally speaking, a bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight, and whenever we can arrange that kind of a trade-off, that's good for it. Now, queen takes d2. And in this position, the standard plan for black would be once again to undermine white's center and to keep attacking it. So you'd wish to play something like pawn to d6 and then develop your knight either to c6 or to d7, and you keep pressuring this center. But in this current position, you've got an even stronger move for black to play. Notice that after white moved their queen to d2, it no longer defends this knight on f3, which gives you an opportunity to trade off here and to ruin their pawn structure. So now all these pawns are weak, and it's going to be a long-term problem for white. In fact, you can play queen h4 and target this weak pawn right away. You're also somewhat pressuring the f2 pawn, of course currently it is defended, so mostly you're hitting the pawn on d4. And your plan, generally speaking, would be to bring your knight here to c6, put in one more attack to this pawn, and then possibly to castle queenside, because on the king side you've got this open file, although you may castle there, but it might be slightly dangerous, and therefore, if instead you play knight c6 and castle alone, then you're completely fine, and you keep attacking all these weak squares. Moreover, in most cases, the most popular move according to the database is for white to castle queenside, which is a blunder. It basically blunders this pawn, and you can snatch the pawn immediately. Now you're a pawn up, and there is nothing white can do really, and your position is great. You're attacking the other pawn on e5, you're threatening to take bishop takes c3 and ruin their pawn structure on the queen side as well, on top of all the other weaknesses they have. And your plan, generally speaking, is the same. Knight c6, attacking all these weaknesses, castle, and your position is already winning. It was really fun how white played seemingly natural moves and got out of an opening with such a ruined position. All in all, I'm sure you'll get a lot of victories with this opening. If you want to learn more about this, check out this video. And if you want to know my secret methods that allow my students to progress faster than ever, check out this free masterclass. Have a great rest of the day. Talk soon.